Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host Mitch, glad to have you here. If this is your first time, let me give you a quick rundown on what we're all about. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we build fun and inexpensive focused commander decks. A focused commander deck is more tuned than a casual deck, but not quite to the level of a competitive or optimized deck. Today's episode is going to be a special one though, where we exclude the cost of the commander. With just a $25 budget, it's pretty much impossible to build around some commanders unless we do so. Sometimes you get lucky and open up a commander in a pack, or you could just trade for them if you really want to build around them. So our budget is still going to be $25, but again, that's $25 for just 99 cards because we're excluding the cost of that commander. And prices on this show are powered by our sponsor, TCGPLAYER. Before we get started today though, make sure you go check out our new classic pink playmat and Commander's Quarters t-shirts on thecommandersquarters.com. And thank you to everyone who's already purchased our merchandise, it really does help support the channel. Also, make sure that you subscribe to the channel and click that little bell notification icon so that you can stay up to date in the latest Commander's Quarters episodes. Today's commander is Rakdos the Showstopper. Rakdos is a 6/6 demon with flying and trample, and it costs 4 black-red. It has, when Rakdos the Showstopper enters the battlefield, flip a coin for each creature that isn't a demon, devil, or imp. Destroy each creature whose coin comes up tails. So this is a pretty incredible effect coming from the command zone. Rakdos can be a pseudo one-sided board wipe if we build our deck in the right way. So what's our strategy with this deck? Well, we're going to cast demonic creatures and then wipe the board with Rakdos. Again, the only creatures that are completely safe are going to be demons, devils, and imps, so we're going to be building the deck around them. And although Rakdos' effect isn't a true board wipe, most of the time it's going to get rid of about half of our opponent's creatures, which is huge. And then how do we win with this deck? Well, we're going to abuse Rakdos' enter the battlefield trigger and then overwhelm our opponents with our demonic army. Since the trigger happens when Rakdos enters the battlefield and not on cast, there are plenty of ways that we can take advantage of this. So even though an opponent's creature might survive that initial coin flip, they're not going to be around for very long if we keep doing that effect. As with all Commander's Quarters decks, I'm going to break this deck down into 10 different tactics that show you how the deck works and how you're going to win with it. So let's go on to our first tactic. Tactic number 1, Death Metal. First up is Wayfarer's Bauble, which we can pay 2 to tap and sacrifice to search our library for a basic land to put into play tapped. And then we've got Prismatic Lens, which can either tap for a colorless or it can filter our mana. Mind Stone is up next. It can either tap for a colorless, or we can pay 1 to tap and sacrifice it to draw a card. Next up, we've got Sphere of the Suns, which enters the battlefield tapped with 3 charge counters on it, and we can tap to remove one of those charge counters to add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool. And then there's Star Compass, which also enters the battlefield tapped. It can tap for either of our colors depending on our land situation. By paying 1 into Rakdos Signet and tapping it, we can add black-red to our mana pool. And then there's Rakdos Locket, which can tap for either of our colors, and we can pay 4 Rakdos to tap and sacrifice it to draw 2 cards. Next up is Worn Power Stone, which enters the battlefield tapped, but it can tap for 2 colorless. And Hedron Archive can also tap for 2 colorless, or we can pay 2 to tap and sacrifice it to draw 2 cards. Finally, there's Unstable Obelisk, which only taps for a colorless, but we can pay 7 to tap and sacrifice it to destroy target permanent. Rakdos has a lot of problems dealing with certain types of permanents, so this card can come in huge. So these mana rocks are great, but they're not the only way that we can ramp with this deck. So let's go through some more cards that help us do that in tactic number 2, Monumentous Occasion. First up, there's Hazoret's Monument, which says, red creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and whenever you cast a creature spell, you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. We are running a decent amount of red creatures in this deck, and then our commander's also going to benefit from that cost reduction. On top of that, whenever we cast a creature spell, we get to loot, which technically isn't card advantage, but does help us get rid of any dead cards in our hand. And we're also going to be running Bontu's Monument, which says, black creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and whenever you cast a creature spell, each opponent loses 1 life, and you gain 1 life. There are a ton of black creature spells in this deck that are going to benefit from this. And draining every single one of our opponents anytime we cast a creature spell actually does add up throughout the game. This card is not only good at helping us stay alive, but it's also good at helping finish off our opponents that might be low. So once we've ramped, we can cast our commander to help wipe the board. But we also need to make sure that we can dig further into our deck to get some of our other threats. So let's go through some ways to do that in tactic number 3, the Price of Power. First up, we've got Read the Bones, which is going to let us scry 2, and then we draw 2 cards, but we lose 2 life. And then there's Siphon Mine, which is basically every other player discards a card and we draw 3. For only 4 mana, you really can't beat that efficiency. But we've also got some creatures that are going to help provide us with some card advantage. First up, there's Sin Prodder, which has, at the beginning of your upkeep, reveal the top card of your library. Any opponent may have you put that card into your graveyard. If a player does, Sin Prodder deals damage to that player equal to that card's converted mana cost, otherwise put that card into your hand. We've got plenty of high converted mana cost cards in this deck, so it's going to be very hard for our opponents to justify continually taking damage. And then there's Bloodgift Demon, which has, at the beginning of your upkeep, target player draws a card and loses 1 life. 1 life is a very small amount for us to pay to draw an extra card each turn. And if one of our opponents is really low, we can even help finish them off with this card. Next up is Krav the Unredeemed, which has pay a black, sacrifice X creatures, target player draws X cards and gains X life, put X +1/+1 counters on Krav the Unredeemed. There are times in this deck where we want to sacrifice a certain creature, so Krav can provide that value. On top of that, if one of our opponents ever tries to wipe the board, we can just sacrifice all of our creatures and actually get some value out of it. And then there's Demon Lord Bells Unlock, which has, when it enters the battlefield, exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card and then put that card into your hand. If that card's converted mana cost is 4 or greater, we repeat this process and then it deals 1 damage to us for each card put into our hand this way. Again, with this deck, we're running plenty of cards that have a converted mana cost of 4 or greater. So even though we're going to be taking some damage, Bells Unlock provides us with a ton of card advantage. And then we've got a couple of cards that benefit from our Commander's Wrath effect. First, there's Shadows of the Past, which is an enchantment that says whenever a creature dies, scry 1. And then if we have 4 more creature cards in our graveyard, we can pay 4 and a black to make each opponent lose 2 life and we gain 2 life. While that ability is nice, we really just have it in here for that scry effect. Our commander and some of our other creatures are going to be killing a ton of our opponent's creatures. And this makes something like Harvester of Souls very effective. Because with it in play, whenever another non-token creature dies, we can draw a card. And then Kothafed Soul Hoarder is similar. It has whenever a permanent owned by another player is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you draw a card and lose 1 life. So while there is a slight downside, the card advantage is going to make up for that. And finally, there's Bloodspeaker, which is a very unique card that fits right into this deck. It has at the beginning of your upkeep, you may sacrifice Bloodspeaker. If you do, search your library for a demon card, reveal that card, and put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library. And when a demon comes into play under your control, return Bloodspeaker from your graveyard to your hand. So this is basically just a recurable tutor for our demons. And since we have some demons with some pretty powerful effects, this card can come in huge. So what are some of those effects that we might want to get? Let's go through some of them now in tactic number 4, a Torturous Time. First up is Netling Imp, which is a pretty old card, so I'm going to read the Oracle text for it. It has tap, choose target non-wall creature the active player has controlled continuously since the beginning of the turn. That creature attacks this turn if able, destroy it at the beginning of the next end step if it didn't attack this turn. Activate this ability only during an opponent's turn before attackers are declared. So basically, to boil it down, we can just tap Nettling Imp to force an opponent to attack with a creature. And then Maddening Imp does this in an even bigger way. It can tap to basically force an opponent to attack with all their non-wall creatures. So whatever creatures survive Rakdos' coin flips aren't going to survive for long with these in play. We've got plenty of huge creatures that we can force our opponents to attack into with these cards. Next up is Indulgent Tormentor, which has, at the beginning of your upkeep, draw a card unless target opponent sacrifices a creature or pays 3 life. So this card can either provide us with some more card advantage, or it can get rid of our opponent's creatures. And then whenever Nephrox, Overlord of Grixis, attacks alone, the defending player is going to have to sacrifice a creature. And then when Shadowborn Demon enters the battlefield, we get to destroy target non-demon creature. But at the beginning of our upkeep, if there are fewer than 6 creature cards in our graveyard, we have to sacrifice a creature. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, however. We'll get into it later, but there are times that we want to actually sacrifice our commander, which makes Eater of Hope especially effective in this deck. We can either pay a black to sacrifice another creature to regenerate Eater of Hope, or we can pay 2 and a black to sacrifice 2 other creatures to destroy target creature. And sacrificing creatures is a great way to trigger Reaper from the Abyss. It has Morbid. At the beginning of each end step, if a creature died this turn, destroy target non-demon creature. This card is great at helping us pick off any of those creatures that might have survived Rakdos' Wrath effect. Next up is Demon of Dark Schemes, which is going to give all other creatures -2/-2 until the end of the turn when it comes into play. On top of that, whenever another creature dies, we're going to get 1 energy. And then we can pay 2 and a black and 4 energy to put target creature card from our graveyard onto the battlefield under our control tapped. So while this might only take out small creatures, we're still going to get a ton of value out of this card throughout the game. And then there's Archfiend of Depravity, which is excellent at keeping our opponent's boards small. It has, at the beginning of each opponent's end step, that player chooses up to 2 creatures he or she controls and then sacrifices the rest. And Pestilence Demon can be a consistent board wipe for us. By paying a black, Pestilence Demon is going to deal 1 damage to each creature and each player. In general, our creatures have quite a bit of toughness, so they can survive a decent amount of damage. And Pestilence Demon is also excellent at finishing off any opponents that might be low on life. And finally, there's Reaver Demon, which has, when it enters the battlefield, if you cast it from your hand, destroy all non-artifact, non-black creatures, and they can't be regenerated. The vast majority of creatures in this deck are black, so our creatures are mostly going to be safe, and our opponents probably won't be. So we've talked about dealing with our opponent's creatures on the battlefield, but what about dealing with their hands? Let's go through some ways to do that now in tactic number 5, Abandon All Hope. First up is Herald of Anguish, which has, at the beginning of your end step, each opponent discards a card. And then we can pay 1 and a black to sacrifice an artifact to give target creature -2/-2 until the end of the turn. Now, forcing our opponents to discard 1 card each time around the table is great, but forcing them to discard all their cards is even better. So that's why we're running Sire of Insanity, which says at the beginning of each end step, each player discards his or her hand. So after Rakdos has locked down the board, we can basically just use Sire of Insanity to lock down our opponent's hands. From that point forward, they're going to be in top deck mode just waiting to find that right answer. And if they don't find it quickly, it's going to be very easy for us to finish them off. But these aren't the only demons that have some pretty powerful effects, so let's go through some more in tactic number 6, Demonic Glee. First up is Archfiend of Ifnir, which has, whenever you cycle or discard another card, put a -1/-1 counter on each creature your opponents control. And it can also be cycled for 2. So if we have this in play with something like Sire of Insanity, we can really decimate our opponent's boards. And then there's Stronghold Overseer, which has Shadow, so it's pretty much impossible for our opponents to block it. And then we can pay black to give creatures with shadow +1/+0 until the end of the turn, and creatures without shadow get -1/-0 until the end of the turn. So we can use this ability offensively to pump the Stronghold Overseer, or we can use it defensively to shrink our opponent's creatures. And finally there's Abhorrent Overlord, which has, when it enters the battlefield, put a number of 1/1 black harpy creature tokens with flying onto the battlefield equal to your devotion to black. And at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice a creature. It's not always a bad thing for us to have to sacrifice a creature with this deck, and the number of harpy tokens that we can get can be absurd. So we've talked about a lot of creatures that have some pretty fantastic effects, but we're also going to be running some creatures that are just good beaters. So let's go through them now in tactic number 7, the hits keep coming. First up, there's Herald of Torment, which we can either bestow on another creature, or it's just a 3/3 with flying. It does have the slight downside though, that at the beginning of your upkeep you lose 1 life. And Greeting Demon also has a downside that we lose 2 life during our upkeep, but it is a 6/6 for 4 mana. Next up is Halo Hunter, which is going to destroy an angel when it comes into the battlefield, and it's a 6/3 with Intimidate for just 5 mana. And then there's Archdemon of Paliano, which is just straight up a 5/4 flyer for 4 mana. Next there's Demon of Catastrophes, which has the downside that we have to sacrifice a creature in order to cast it, but it is a 6/6 with flying and trample for only 4 mana. Desecration Demon is also a 6/6 flyer, but it has, at the beginning of each combat, any opponent may sacrifice a creature. If that player does, tap Desecration Demon and put a +1/+1 counter on it. With the amount of creatures that we're going to be killing with this deck, it's going to be very hard for our opponents to justify sacking a creature in this way. And finally there's Chaos Imps, which is just basically going to be a 7/6 flying trample, since we're going to unleash it most of the time. So like Chaos Imp, there are a couple of other creatures in this deck that aren't demons. Let's go through the rest now in tactic number 8, Demonic Friends. First up there's Torch Fiend, which we can pay a red to sacrifice it to destroy target artifact. And then there's Cadaver Imp, which when it enters the battlefield, we can return target creature card from our graveyard to our hand. This card can come in huge in the right situation, getting us back one of our key creatures. Next up is Hellrider, which says, whenever a creature you control attacks, Hellrider deals 1 damage to a defending player. This is just a great way to speed up that kill clock on our opponents. And then there's Anger, and as long as it's in our graveyard and we control a mountain, creatures we control have haste. We've got a ton of huge threats in this deck, and by giving them haste, that just makes them even more deadly. Finally, there's Changeling Berserker, which is going to make us champion a creature when it comes into play. This means that we have to sacrifice it unless we exile another creature we control, and then when it leaves play, that card returns to play. This card can come in huge by allowing us to exile Rakdos to get his enter the battlefield trigger again. But we've got even more ways to abuse Rakdos' trigger. Let's go through those ways now in tactic number 9, Showtime. First up is Voyager Staff, which we can pay 2 to sacrifice it to exile target creature, and then we return the exiled card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So for just 2 mana, we can exile Rakdos to get that Wrath effect again. And then there's Synod Sanctum, which we can pay 2 to tap to exile target permanent we control, and then pay 2 again to sacrifice it to return all cards exiled with Synod Sanctum to the battlefield under your control. And next up is Cold Storage, which we can pay 3 to exile a creature that we control. And then at any point we can sacrifice it to put all those creatures back into play. Now with Synod Sanctum and Cold Storage, we have to be a little bit more careful, because if these cards are removed before we can get their effect, our creatures are going to be stuck in exile. But if we take the right precautions, both of these cards can be excellent for this deck. And then we've got a couple of cards that can bring our commander back right when it dies. Undying Evil is going to give him Undying until the end of the turn. And Supernatural Stamina and Abnormal Endurance do the exact same thing. They're going to give target creature +2/+0, and when that creature dies, return to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. These cards really help us utilize those sacrifice effects by allowing us to sacrifice our commander and getting it right back into play. Next up, we've got some auras that help us do that too. Both Unhallowed Pact and Shade's Form say, when enchanted creature dies, return that card to the battlefield under your control. So if we can get one of these cards onto Rakdos, we can really control when this happens. And then there's Twin Flame, which is going to create a copy of one of our creatures. Most of the time we're just going to target Rakdos so we can get that enter the battlefield trigger. And finally there's Oni of Wild Places, which has, at the beginning of your upkeep, return a red creature you control to its owner's hand. This allows us to recast Rakdos on each of our turns, which is an incredible effect. But destroying our opponent's creatures and beating them down isn't the only way that we can win with this deck. So let's go through some other ways that we can win with this deck in tactic number 10, Alternative Rock. First up, there's Liliana's Contract, which says, when it enters the battlefield, you draw 4 cards and lose 4 life. And at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 4 or more demons with different names, you win the game. Now, drawing 4 cards for 4 life is great, but that second effect is incredible with this deck. We are running a ton of demons that all have different names, and it's very easy for us to get 4 onto the battlefield. But while this is a fantastic alternative win condition for the deck, we have an even better one. And that card's going to be the Golden Pig of this deck, which is the number 1 card out of our 99. And that card is Revel in Riches, which is an enchantment that costs 4 and a black. It says, whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, create a colorless treasure artifact token with tap, sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 10 or more treasures, you win the game. This deck excels at killing creatures, and our commander can kill a ton all at once. This is going to create an absurd amount of treasure tokens that we can either use to help us cast more and more spells to get ahead, or we can just use them to win the game if we can keep this on the board. In either situation, this card is absolutely a game changer for this deck, and that's why it's the Golden Pig. This deck is a ton of fun, and although the coin flips might be random, it's very powerful. Again, by adding in more effects to finish off our opponent's creatures, it's going to be hard for them to catch back up. But now that we've gone through the cards that help us win with this deck, let's go through the cards that help make it happen. It's time to go on to the mana base. First up, there's Aether Hub, which when it enters the battlefield, we get 1 energy, and then we can tap it for either a colorless, or we can tap in and pay that 1 energy to add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool. And then we're going to be playing Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, both of which we can tap to sacrifice them to search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. Next up is Rocky Tar Pit, which enters the battlefield tapped, and we can tap to sacrifice it to search our library for a swamp or a mountain and put it onto the battlefield. Then we're going to be running Jund and Grixis Panorama, both of which can tap for a colorless, or we can pay 1 to tap and sacrifice them to search our library for a basic swamp or mountain to put onto the battlefield tapped. Next up is Warp Landscape, which can either tap for a colorless, or we can pay 2 to tap and sacrifice it to search our library for a basic land and put in play tapped. And then there's Urborg Volcano, Rakdos Guildgate, Cinder Barrens, Bloodfell Caves, and Akulum Refuge, each of which enter the battlefield tapped and tap for either a black or red mana. On top of that, Bloodfell Caves and Akulum Refuge will gain us 1 life when they come into play. When Rakdos Carnarium enters the battlefield, it enters tapped and it's going to make us return a land we control back to our hand. It does have the upside though of tapping for black-red. And finally, we're going to be running 24 basic lands, 19 of those will be swamps and 5 will be mountains. And now that we've gone through every single card in this deck, let's do a quick price check. A quick reminder that our deck costs are calculated using TCGPLAYER optimization, optimizing with even heavily played and damaged cards because those cards need a home too. Because this is a brand new commander, EDH Rec doesn't actually have any decks that are built with him yet. But I can guarantee you that once EDH Rec does have those deck prices, the average is going to be much higher than our deck, coming in at just $24.93. And just a quick reminder that our deck cost does not include the commander because it's a commander excluded episode. Again, Commander's Quarters decks are built to be tuned in focused within their budget, but there are always ways that we can improve on them. So let's go through some reasonable upgrades to see what some of those ways just might be. First up, there's Black Market, which comes in at $4.58. It's an enchantment that costs 3 black, and it says whenever a creature dies, put a charge counter on Black Market. At the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, add black to your mana pool for each charge counter on Black Market. This deck kills a ton of creatures, and this card is going to generate us a lot of mana. And then there's Master of Cruelties, which comes in at $7.68. It's a 1/4 demon with First Strike and Death Touch, and it costs 3 black-red. It can only attack alone, but when it attacks a player and it's not blocked, that player's life total becomes 1, and then Master of Cruelties assigns no combat damage this combat. So after we've completely wiped an opponent's board, Master of Cruelties can get through to just put their life total down to 1. Next up is Krark's Thumb, which comes in at $4.90. It's a legendary artifact that costs 2, and it says if you would flip a coin, instead flip 2 coins and ignore 1. This card is excellent because it gives us a second chance to kill those creatures that we missed on the first flip. And then there's Conjurer's Closet, which comes in at $2.73. It's an artifact that costs 5, and it says at the beginning of your end step, you may exile target creature you control and then return that card to the battlefield under your control. This is just a great way for us to get Rakdos' trigger again every single turn. Next up is Blade of Cells, which comes in at $4.89. It's an equipment that costs 2, and it costs 4 to equip, and it says equipped creature has Myriad. So if we equip this to Rakdos and it attacks, we're going to get a ton of its enter the battlefield triggers. And the more opponents that there are, the more chances that we have to kill all of their creatures with coin flips. Finally, there's Hemel the Host, which comes in at $3.30. It's an equipment that costs 4, and it costs 5 to equip. It says at the beginning of combat on your turn, create a token that's a copy of equipped creature, except that token isn't legendary if equipped creature is legendary. That token gains haste. So again, this is just a great way for us to abuse Rakdos' enter the battlefield triggers, and we even get to keep those creatures. And with that, our show is coming to a close, but I really just want to hear about what you think about this deck, so why don't you let me know in the comments below. When you're buying decks like this one, or just individual cards, make sure you use that decklist link in the description below. Not only will you be getting great prices on TCGPLAYER, but you're also going to be supporting this show because they sponsor us. And make sure that you follow us on social media so you can get some early hints on who the next commander just might be. Links to our social media accounts can be found in the description. Also in the description below is a link to the Commander's Quarters Patreon page, and I just want to say a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron for the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There's even a general level tier where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. I truly couldn't do this without all of your support, so from the bottom of my heart, thank you. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel, and then check out some of our playlists on budget commander decks, commander excluded decks, and break the bank episodes. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again, and have a good one.